"I'm sorry, sir, but there must be a mistake," she said, her voice dripping with disdain. "These seats are for our first-class passengers." For 60 years, Walter Blackwood had faced men and women who told him he couldn't. He couldn't get a loan, couldn't start a business, couldn't possibly compete with the established players in aviation. Now, at 80 years old, sitting in seat 1A of a multi-billion-dollar airline he had built from nothing, a flight attendant was telling him he didn't belong. The woman Amanda Whitley looked at his worn tweed jacket and his wife Josephine's simple dress and saw only peasants in the palace. The mistake wasn't on the boarding pass. The mistake was hers, and it was about to cost her everything. Walter Blackwood had never been a man of flash or pretense. Born in 1943 in rural Georgia, he'd grown up watching planes streak across the sky and dreamed of flight. After serving as one of the few black pilots in Vietnam, he returned home to find commercial airlines unwilling to hire him despite his exemplary record. "We just don't have positions for colored pilots," one hiring manager had told him bluntly in 1969. "Our passengers wouldn't feel comfortable." That rejection was just one of many Walter faced, but instead of breaking him, it steeled his resolve. He purchased a single cargo plane with his military savings and a small family loan, flying mail and packages between regional airports when no one would give him a seat in the cockpit of a passenger plane. From that single plane, Horizon Airways was born. Through 6 decades of strategic expansion, Walter had transformed his humble cargo service into one of the world's premier passenger airlines. His route map now spanned 6 continents, his fleet numbered in the hundreds, and his company employed over 48,000 people. At his side, through it all, was Josephine, his wife of 55 years. While Walter flew planes, Josephine flew through balance sheets and financing deals with equal precision. A former mathematics professor with a gift for financial strategy, she had structured the complex deals that allowed their company to expand aggressively when opportunities arose. "They'll lend to a white businessman with half your collateral and twice your debt," she once observed after another bank rejection in their early years. "So we'll have to be twice as good and 3 times as persistent." Together, they had faced discrimination at every turn. Banks that wouldn't lend to them, executives who wouldn't meet with them, industry functions where they were mistaken for the help. They had overcome it all with a quiet dignity and relentless competence that eventually made even their staunchest doubters into believers. As they approached their 80s, the Blackwoods had stepped back from daily operations, entrusting their company to a carefully selected executive team. But they never lost their passion for the airline or their connection to its service standards. 4 times a year, they traveled incognito on different Horizon routes, observing the operation from a passenger's perspective. They dressed, simply carried their own luggage, and revealed their identities to no one. It was their way of ensuring that the company never lost sight of what mattered most, treating every passenger with dignity and respect, regardless of appearance or status. The premier cabin of Horizon Airways' flagship, the Skymaster 900, was a sanctuary of curated luxury, a world of brushed aluminum, muted cashmere upholstery, and soft ambient lighting. The air smelled of expensive leather and citrusy notes of complimentary champagne. It was designed to insulate passengers from the realities of travel, a hermetically sealed tube of privilege hurtling through the stratosphere from New York's JFK to London Heathrow. The 16 suites in this exclusive cabin represented the pinnacle of commercial aviation luxury. Each featured a fully reclining seat that transformed into a flat bed, a 24-inch entertainment screen, noise-canceling headphones, and privacy panels that could create a personal cocoon. The cabin had its own dedicated lavatory with premium toiletries, and meals were served on fine china with real silverware. A passenger in the premier cabin would never hear the word no. Everything from custom meal requests to specific temperature preferences were accommodated without question. The standard price for this 7-hour journey of luxury was $12,000 round trip, a sum that ensured exclusivity. The passengers who occupied these seats were accustomed to such surroundings. CEOs, celebrities, royalty from small European countries, and the quietly wealthy who inherited fortunes rather than built them. They moved through this rarefied air with a particular kind of entitled nonchalance, the practiced boredom of those for whom extreme luxury was simply the expected baseline. At the front of the premier cabin, the Heritage Suites 1A and 1B were the most coveted positions on the aircraft. These special accommodations were slightly larger than the other suites and featured additional amenities like heated floors and enhanced privacy. They were typically reserved for the airline's most valuable customers, or occasionally upgraded loyal travelers celebrating special occasions. The Heritage name was an inside reference to the airline's beginnings, though few employees understood the significance of the designation. For the passengers filling the cabin that evening, a tech billionaire in an expensive but deliberately casual hoodie, a well-known actress hiding behind oversized sunglasses, a Wall Street banker checking multiple phones. This environment was an expected extension of their daily lives. For them, the premier cabin wasn't a luxury. It was simply where they belonged. Amanda Whitley was in her own mind the epitome of the Horizon Airways brand. At 38, she had the sleek, polished appearance that matched the airline's premium image. Her blonde hair styled in a perfect chignon, her makeup flawlessly applied, and her uniform pressed to military precision. The navy blue suit with its subtle gold piping and the signature Horizon scarf tied just so around her neck were not merely a uniform to Amanda. They were a suit of armor that transformed her into someone who belonged in the world of luxury she serviced. Amanda had not always inhabited such rarefied air. Growing up in a small town in rural Pennsylvania, she had been raised by a single mother who worked 2 jobs to keep them afloat. Their small apartment above a laundromat had been clean but sparse with furniture from thrift stores and groceries carefully budgeted to stretch through the month. "People like us don't belong in places like that," her mother had once whispered, pulling her away from the window of an exclusive boutique where Amanda had been admiring a dress. That lesson, that there were places where people like her were not welcome, had shaped her profoundly. When she secured a position as a flight attendant 17 years ago, Amanda had discovered a path to the world she had always admired from afar. The job had started as a way to escape her hometown, but it had evolved into a mission to reinvent herself. She had studied the passengers in first class, how they spoke, how they dressed, how they carried themselves with an assurance she coveted. She had practiced their mannerisms in her hotel room mirror, gradually shedding her working-class accent and adopting the polished tones of the educated elite. Her rise to lead flight attendant on the prestigious transatlantic route had been a hard-fought victory. She had volunteered for the most challenging flights, worked holidays without complaint, and cultivated relationships with supervisors who could advance her career. When she finally secured the premier cabin position, it felt like validation that she had successfully crossed an invisible boundary, that she had finally arrived in the world she had always wanted to join. Amanda now saw herself not merely as a service provider, but as a gatekeeper. The premier cabin was her domain, a carefully curated experience that reflected her own standards of excellence. She took immense pride in recognizing regular first-class travelers, memorizing their preferences, and making them feel individually acknowledged. She judged her success by the smooth operation of the cabin and the satisfied nods of passengers who took such service as their due. But beneath Amanda's polished exterior lurked a deep insecurity and a fearful conviction that she could at any moment be exposed as an imposter. This insecurity manifested as a fierce adherence to unwritten rules of class and status. She could spot what she considered an undeserving upgrade passenger immediately, the nervous shuffling, the overexcitement at the amenities, or worst of all, clothing that didn't meet the unspoken dress code of wealth. These passengers received technically correct service from Amanda, but none of the warmth or special touches she reserved for those she deemed authentic members of the elite. What Amanda failed to recognize was how her insecurities had transformed her into the very type of person who would have excluded her younger self. The painful irony was that in her quest to belong among the privileged, she had become an enforcer of the same arbitrary boundaries that had once hurt her so deeply. Into this sanctuary of luxury walked Walter and Josephine Blackwood. To Amanda Whitley, they were an anomaly, a glitch in the carefully composed tableau of wealth. Walter moved with the slow, deliberate pace of a man who had walked many miles in his life. He wore a simple, well-made but undeniably old tweed jacket, comfortable corduroy trousers, and scuffed but polished leather brogues. His face was a roadmap of struggle and triumph, his deep brown skin marked with the lines of age, his eyes holding a calm intelligence beneath wire-rimmed glasses. Josephine was his perfect complement. Her silver gray hair was pulled back in a simple bun, and she wore no makeup beyond a touch of lipstick. Her only jewelry was a plain gold wedding band and an old-fashioned watch, a Patek Philippe that had been her grandfather's worth more than most of the ostentatious pieces worn by other passengers, but recognizable only to the truly knowledgeable. Her dress was dark navy merino wool chosen for warmth and practicality rather than style. They carried their own bags, a worn leather satchel for Walter that contained reading materials and his medications, and a simple tote for Josephine with her knitting and crossword puzzles. Nothing about their appearance suggested they could afford the $24,000 they had spent on their round-trip tickets. Nothing, that is, except the quiet confidence with which they moved, unintimidated by the luxury, because they had designed much of it themselves. As they stepped onto the plane, they were greeted by Sofia Hernandez, a junior flight attendant in her mid-20s, with a warm smile and genuine enthusiasm for her role. "Welcome aboard Horizon Airways," she said, checking their boarding passes. Her eyes widened slightly at the seat assignments. The Heritage Suites were rarely occupied by passengers who looked like the Blackwoods, but she maintained her professional demeanor. As they moved toward the premier cabin, they passed Amanda Whitley, who was arranging welcome champagne flutes on a silver tray. Her eyes flicked over the elderly couple, registering their simple attire and worn luggage, and immediately her internal alarms began to sound. They did not fit the expected profile of Heritage Suite passengers. Amanda set down her tray and moved to intercept them at the entrance to the cabin. She positioned herself like a sentry, her posture a physical manifestation of the boundary she was determined to enforce. "Good evening," she said, her voice carrying practiced warmth that never quite reached her eyes. "Can I help you find your seats?" Walter nodded politely. "We're in 1A and 1B, thank you, and 1B. Amanda's smile tightened, the confirmation of her suspicions visible in the slight narrowing of her eyes. "The Heritage Suites. I think there may have been a mistake at check-in. Those are our premier first-class accommodations." She emphasized first class with a subtle inflection that suggested she was explaining something to someone who might not grasp the concept. Josephine looked up at Amanda, her expression calm but penetrating. "Yes, we're aware. That's what our tickets indicate." The standoff had begun, and with it, the first thread of a tapestry of consequences was about to unravel across the Atlantic and beyond. Amanda's smile remained fixed, but her eyes performed a rapid assessment of the couple standing before her. Everything about them triggered her internal classification system, categorizing them as misplaced. Passengers who clearly belonged in the main cabin, but had somehow ended up with premium tickets they didn't deserve. "Perhaps I could see your boarding passes," she said, extending a manicured hand. The request was framed as assistance, but delivered with the authority of someone who expected to find a problem. Walter handed over their boarding passes with a calm that came from decades of being underestimated. He had faced far more imposing obstacles than an airline employee with an attitude problem. "I believe you'll find everything in order," he said, his voice betraying neither annoyance nor defensiveness. Amanda examined the passes with theatrical thoroughness, turning them over as if the solution to this incongruity might be printed on the reverse. The names matched, Blackwood W and Blackwood J, as did the seat assignments 1A and 1B. She frowned slightly, not yet willing to concede. "These do show the heritage suites," she admitted reluctantly. "But there seems to be some confusion. Those are our most exclusive accommodations." The emphasis on exclusive carried a clear subtext. They were not for people like them. "There's no confusion," Josephine replied, her voice carrying the quiet authority of a woman who had navigated male-dominated boardrooms for decades. "We're quite aware of what the heritage suites are." By now, several passengers had taken notice of the exchange. A young tech executive in an expensive hoodie glanced up from his laptop with mild curiosity. An older white woman in statement jewelry watched with undisguised interest, perhaps anticipating the entertainment of seeing the interlopers properly redirected. "I understand," Amanda continued, lowering her voice as if to spare the couple embarrassment. "But there may have been a computer error during check-in. These things happen all the time. The system occasionally assigns premium seats incorrectly." She was repositioning her objection, moving from outright denial to a technical explanation that allowed her to maintain her authority while appearing helpful. Walter's patience was considerable but not infinite. "Young lady," he said, his tone firm but not unkind. "We've been flying for over 60 years. We're quite familiar with airline procedures. If you scan our boarding passes, the computer will confirm our seating assignment." Amanda's smile tightened further. Being addressed as young lady by this elderly man struck her as patronizing, though she failed to recognize the irony of her own condescension. The couple's continued insistence was beginning to feel like a challenge to her authority in her domain, and Amanda Whitley did not appreciate challenges. "I'm trying to prevent an awkward situation," she said, her voice taking on a sharper edge. "These suites are typically reserved for our regular premium travelers. Perhaps you were upgraded due to the flight being oversold in your original class. This suggestion, that they couldn't possibly have booked these seats intentionally, was the first direct insult thinly veiled as concern. Josephine's eyes, sharp despite her years, narrowed slightly. "We booked these seats specifically," she said. "We did not receive an upgrade." A few rows back, a businessman in an Italian suit smirked at the exchange, clearly amused by what he perceived as the couple's persistence in the face of their obvious displacement. His expression silently communicated solidarity with Amanda, a shared understanding that some spaces were reserved for certain types of people and gatekeepers like her were necessary to maintain those boundaries. "I see," Amanda said, though her tone suggested she didn't see at all. She glanced around the cabin, noting the filling seats and the line of premium passengers still waiting to board. The timing was inconvenient for a prolonged dispute. "Why don't we step into the galley to sort this out?" It was not a question, but a directive delivered with the expectation of compliance. Walter shook his head slightly. "There's nothing to sort out. Our seats are 1A and 1B, and that's where we intend to sit." His tone was not confrontational, but carried the unmistakable weight of a man accustomed to being heard. Amanda's professional veneer cracked slightly, her frustration showing in the tightening of her jaw. "Sir, I have other passengers boarding. I'm trying to help you avoid embarrassment." The threat was implied but clear. Comply now or face public humiliation. "The only one risking embarrassment in this situation isn't us," Josephine said quietly, her gaze level and unwavering. It was at this moment that Sophia, who had been watching the interaction with growing discomfort, stepped forward. "Amanda," she said hesitantly, "I checked their boarding passes at the door. They do show the heritage suites." Amanda turned to her junior colleague, her expression sharpening. "I'm handling this, Sophia." The dismissal was immediate and absolute. Sophia hesitated, then stepped back, her brief moment of courage extinguished by Amanda's authority. But her intervention had not gone unnoticed by the Blackwoods, who exchanged a brief glance, a silent communication honed by decades of partnership. The standoff at the entrance to the premier cabin had now become a public spectacle, precisely the kind of disruption that Amanda had claimed to be preventing. Yet it was her own refusal to accept the evidence before her that had created the scene. Her certainty that these people did not belong had overridden both the printed evidence and her colleague's confirmation. "That won't be necessary," a male voice interrupted its crisp, authoritative tone, cutting through the tension. Miguel Rodriguez, the purser for the flight, had arrived at Amanda's side, his perfectly pressed uniform and confident stance marking him as someone of authority. At 45, Miguel had the polished presence of a man who had mastered the art of assertive hospitality, able to make difficult passengers feel simultaneously cared for and firmly managed. "I can assist with this," he told Amanda, taking the boarding passes from her hand. He scanned them quickly, his expression professionally neutral, but with a subtle undercurrent of skepticism that mirrored Amanda's. Miguel and Amanda had worked together on the transatlantic route for nearly 5 years and had developed the synchronized understanding of long-term colleagues. They shared a certain vision of how the premier cabin should operate and who belonged within it. Their unspoken communication now, a raised eyebrow from Miguel, a slight head tilt from Amanda, carried an entire conversation about the situation at hand. "Mr. and Mrs. Blackwood," Miguel said, consulting the manifest on his tablet with exaggerated care. "I see the system has assigned you to our heritage suites." The emphasis on the system suggested an error rather than a legitimate booking. However, we seem to be facing a technical discrepancy. Walter's expression remained calm, but a slight tightening around his eyes suggested his patience was wearing thinner. "What discrepancy would that be, young man? Our names are on your list, our boarding passes match, and as far as I can tell, seats 1A and 1B are currently unoccupied." Miguel's professional smile didn't waver, but his eyes hardened slightly at being addressed as young man. The same reaction Amanda had shown moments earlier. Neither recognized that their own condescension had invited the response. "The discrepancy," Miguel explained with deliberate patience, "is that these particular suites are normally reserved through our executive loyalty program." It was a fabrication smoothly delivered. There was no such formal restriction on the heritage suites, which could be booked by anyone willing to pay the premium price. But it was a convenient fiction to justify the continued obstruction. "That's simply not true," Josephine said, her voice carrying the precision of a former mathematics professor. "We booked these seats directly through your website, paid the full fare, and received confirmation. There is no loyalty program restriction." A few feet away, Sophia shifted uncomfortably. She knew Josephine was correct. There was no such booking restriction, but challenging Miguel directly would be a career-limiting move. Instead, she busied herself with preparing welcome drinks, keeping one ear tuned to the escalating confrontation. The standoff was drawing more attention now. A famous actress in 3F slipped her designer sunglasses on, as if the scene were too vulgar to watch directly. The tech executive in 2D had stopped pretending to work on his laptop and was now openly watching the drama unfold. His expression caught between discomfort and fascination. Miguel lowered his voice, leaning in slightly as if to share a confidence. "I understand this is frustrating, but we need to resolve this quickly to avoid delaying departure. If you'll step into the galley, I'm sure we can find you suitable alternative seating." The offer presented as a compromise was in fact another level of dismissal, an attempt to remove the problem from public view. Walter straightened to his full height, which, despite his 80 years, was still impressive. "We will not be stepping anywhere except into our assigned seats," he said, each word measured and distinct. "Your manifest confirms our booking, our boarding passes confirm our seats, and we have paid for this specific accommodation." Miguel's face flushed slightly at the direct challenge to his authority. He glanced at the line of premium passengers still waiting to board, aware that this confrontation was creating exactly the type of scene the airline trained its staff to avoid. But rather than recognizing his own role in escalating the situation, he doubled down. "Sir, I must insist," he said, his tone hardening. "We cannot delay boarding for this discussion. Please come with me to the galley so we can resolve this privately." It was no longer a request, but a command delivered with the expectation of immediate compliance. For a moment, Walter and Josephine stood perfectly still, the center of a storm of awkward attention. They had faced this type of discrimination countless times in their long lives. Being told they didn't belong couldn't possibly have the means or the right to occupy certain spaces. In their younger years, they had sometimes fought, sometimes strategically retreated. But age had given them a different perspective on these battles. Walter glanced at his watch, the same modest Timex he had worn for decades, despite having the means to purchase any timepiece in the world. Then he looked at Josephine, a silent question in his eyes. She gave him an almost imperceptible nod. "Very well," Walter said finally, his voice betraying no emotion. "We will continue this discussion in the galley." With that, he and Josephine moved toward the forward galley, their dignified bearing undiminished by what many of the watching passengers interpreted as a concession of defeat. What none of them realized was that Walter and Josephine Blackwood were not retreating. They were simply choosing their battlefield with the strategic patience of generals who had won many long campaigns. Sofia Hernandez stood in the premier cabin, arranging crystal glasses on a silver tray with trembling hands. Born to Dominican immigrants in the Bronx, she had worked her way through community college while helping in her parents' bodega, eventually earning a hospitality degree that had led to her dream job with the airline. For Sofia, becoming a flight attendant wasn't just employment. It was achievement, a step toward the better life her parents had sacrificed to give her. She approached each flight with genuine enthusiasm and a natural warmth that passengers responded to instinctively. As she watched the Blackwoods being escorted to the galley, a knot of discomfort tightened in her stomach. She had seen their boarding passes. They were legitimate, properly issued for the heritage suites. There was no technical error, no system glitch, no justification for the treatment they were receiving beyond the unspoken but unmistakable judgment that they didn't look the part. Sofia had experienced similar judgments herself. On her first week in premium service training, a senior instructor had pulled her aside and said, "Remember, people like you have to work twice as hard to prove they belong here." The words had burned all the more for their casual cruelty. She recognized that same dismissal in the way Amanda and Miguel were treating the elderly couple. But challenging Amanda Whitley directly was professionally dangerous. The lead flight attendant was known for her long memory when it came to perceived disloyalty. Those who questioned her decisions often found themselves assigned to less desirable routes or scheduled for inconvenient shifts. Sofia had student loans to repay and money to send home. She couldn't afford to become a target. "What's happening up there?" asked a passenger in 4C, a man in his 30s wearing an expensive watch and a cashmere sweater. Sofia composed her features into a professional mask. "Just a seating issue, sir. It's being resolved. May I offer you champagne before takeoff?" The man accepted the drink with a distracted nod, his attention still drawn to the drama unfolding at the front of the cabin. Sofia moved on to the next passenger, her mind racing. She should say something more, do something. But what, and at what cost? Several rows back in the premier cabin, Richard Palmer observed the unfolding drama with growing unease. At 42, Palmer had built a successful technology consulting firm that catered to financial institutions, and he was a regular on the transatlantic route. His casual but expensive attire, a cashmere sweater and tailored trousers, marked him as someone accustomed to luxury, but not ostentatious about it. Palmer had witnessed similar scenes before, the quiet enforcement of unwritten codes about who belonged in premium spaces. Usually he remained a passive observer, neither participating in nor challenging these exclusionary practices. They were, after all, part of the invisible infrastructure that maintained the exclusivity he had paid for. But something about this particular interaction disturbed him. Perhaps it was the dignified way the elderly couple carried themselves, or perhaps it was the increasingly transparent flimsiness of the excuses being made to remove them. Whatever the cause, Palmer found himself unable to dismiss the scene as just another example of the necessary policing of class boundaries. He had been raised in a wealthy Boston family that emphasized the responsibility that came with privilege. His mother, a formidable philanthropist, had instilled in him the principle that true class was demonstrated not by excluding others, but by making them feel welcome regardless of their background. Watching Amanda's thinly veiled contempt and Miguel's bureaucratic obstruction, he couldn't help but feel that a fundamental courtesy was being violated. As the confrontation seemed to reach its conclusion with the elderly couple being led to the galley, Palmer made a decision. He unbuckled his seatbelt and stood up, drawing curious glances from nearby passengers. "Excuse me," he said, addressing Sophia as she passed with her tray of champagne. "Those passengers who were just taken to the galley, their boarding passes were for the Heritage Suites, weren't they?" Sophia hesitated, caught between professional discretion and her growing discomfort with the situation. "Sir, It's a simple question." Palmer pressed his tone polite but firm. "Did they have valid boarding passes for seats 1A and 1B? Sophia glanced toward the galley where Amanda and Miguel were still visible through the partial opening. Then she looked back at Palmer. "Yes, sir, they did." Palmer nodded, his decision confirmed. "Thank you." He made his way toward the front of the cabin, straightening his sweater as he prepared to join a conflict he would normally have avoided. This small act of intervention, a privileged passenger using his status to question the mistreatment of others, represented a crack in the facade of complicity that had allowed such practices to persist. Whether it would make any difference remained to be seen, but it was a ripple in what had previously been still waters of silent acceptance. The forward galley of the Skymaster 900 was a stark contrast to the plush luxury of the premier cabin. Here, the aircraft's utilitarian nature was fully visible. Stainless steel counters, industrial coffee makers, and compact refrigeration units designed for efficiency rather than aesthetics. It was a workspace, the backstage area, where the illusion of effortless luxury was carefully constructed before being presented to premium passengers. Walter and Josephine Blackwood stood side by side in this cramped, functional space, surrounded by the clicks and hums of pre-flight preparations. The galley's bright, unflattering lighting did nothing to diminish their dignified presence. They were not hunched or cowed by their effective banishment from the cabin they had paid to occupy. Instead, they stood straight, their expressions composed as if they were in a boardroom rather than a service area. Miguel positioned himself between them and the cabin entrance, his stance subtly blocking any attempt they might make to return to the disputed seats. Amanda busied herself with paperwork at the counter, her movements sharp and precise, broadcasting her irritation with the continued disruption to her carefully planned service routine. "Now," Miguel said, his tone a careful blend of authority and forced patience, "let's see if we can sort this out without further delay." "There's nothing to sort out," Walter replied evenly. "Our tickets are valid. Our seats are assigned and we intend to occupy them." Miguel's professional smile tightened. "Mr. Blackwood, I understand your frustration, but we need to be practical. The flight is full, boarding is nearly complete, and we need to resolve this situation quickly." "Then the quickest resolution," Josephine observed, "would be to allow us to take our assigned seats." Amanda turned from the counter, her clipboard clutched to her chest like a shield. "The Heritage Suites are our most premium accommodation," she explained with exaggerated patience. "They're typically occupied by our highest-tier loyalty members or passengers who specifically fit the profile of our premium service." The implication hung in the air, unspoken but unmistakable. "You don't fit that profile." Walter's eyes, sharp behind his wire-rimmed glasses, fixed on Amanda. "And what exactly is that profile, Ms. Whitley?" He had noted her name tag when they first encountered her at the cabin entrance. The direct question caught Amanda off guard. The unwritten rules she was enforcing were not meant to be explicitly stated. That would be vulgar, potentially actionable. I simply meant passengers who frequently use our premium services and are familiar with the amenities. She recovered quickly. We are quite familiar with your amenities, Josephine said, her voice cool and precise. We've flown in premium cabins many times on many airlines. Miguel intervened, sensing Amanda might be drawn into dangerous territory. What my colleague means is that we want to ensure all passengers receive the experience they've paid for. Sometimes our booking system creates anomalies that need to be addressed before departure. At that moment, the galley curtain parted, and Richard Palmer stepped in his presence, immediately disrupting the power dynamic in the cramped space. Miguel turned surprise and irritation flashing across his face. "Excuse me, sir, but this area is restricted to crew members during boarding," he said, his tone firm. "If you could please return to your seat." "I couldn't help noticing what's happening here." Palmer interrupted, his Boston accent becoming more pronounced, as it often did when he was uncomfortable or confrontational. "These folks have boarding passes for 1A and 1B, correct?" Miguel's expression hardened. "Sir, this doesn't concern you. We're handling a routine seating issue." "It doesn't look routine to me," Palmer persisted. "It looks like you're denying seats to passengers who have valid boarding passes, and I'd like to understand why." The unexpected challenge from a passenger who clearly belonged in the premium cabin, whose right to be there neither Amanda nor Miguel would question, created a moment of confusion in the carefully constructed narrative they had been building. Before either crew member could respond, Walter spoke up, his deep voice carrying a note of curiosity rather than anger. "Young man, I appreciate your concern, but may I ask why you've involved yourself in this matter?" Palmer turned to Walter, noting the intelligence in the older man's eyes and the quiet dignity in his bearing. "Because what's happening here isn't right," he said simply. "You have tickets for those seats, you should be in those seats. The reasons you're being given don't hold water, and we all know it." The "we all know it" hung in the air, a direct challenge to the pretense that this was merely a technical issue rather than a judgment based on appearance. Miguel's professional demeanor was now visibly strained. "Sir, I must insist that you return to your seat. This discussion—" He was interrupted by the appearance of Sophia at the galley entrance. "Excuse me, Miguel," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But the final premium passengers are boarding and they're asking about welcome drinks." "Thank you, Sophia," Miguel said with barely contained irritation. "Please begin service. We'll be done here momentarily." As Sophia turned to go, her eyes met Walter's briefly, an unspoken apology in her expression. Walter gave her a small, almost imperceptible nod, an acknowledgement of her difficult position that she would remember clearly in the hours to come. Miguel turned back to the situation at hand, now complicated by the presence of Palmer and the need to maintain control of the increasingly chaotic boarding process. "Here's what I propose," he said, adopting a tone of reasonable compromise. "We have 2 available seats in our business premier section. Still a very comfortable experience with priority meal service and fully reclining seats. We can relocate you there, and I'll personally ensure you receive excellent service." "That is not acceptable," Walter said flatly. "We booked specific seats, we paid for specific seats, and we expect to receive what we paid for." Palmer nodded in agreement. "That sounds more than reasonable to me." Amanda's professional facade cracked slightly. "Sir, we're trying to be accommodating, but you're making this very difficult. The aircraft door will be closing soon, and we need to have all passengers properly seated." "We would be properly seated," Josephine pointed out with impeccable logic, "if you would allow us to occupy our assigned seats." Miguel exchanged a glance with Amanda, a silent communication passing between them. The gentle approach wasn't working. It was time for more direct measures. "Mr. and Mrs. Blackwood," Miguel said, his voice hardening, "I need to be clear. We cannot delay this flight for a seating dispute. Either accept the business premier accommodation I've offered, or I'll need to involve the captain, which may result in your removal from the flight entirely." It was no longer a negotiation, but an ultimatum delivered with the confidence of someone who believed they held all the power in the situation. Walter and Josephine exchanged a look, a silent communication born of 55 years together. In that brief glance was a wealth of shared history of battles chosen and battles deferred, of strategic retreats and decisive stands. Josephine reached into her simple tote bag and withdrew an object that seemed entirely out of place with her modest appearance, a sleek dark gray satellite phone. It was a sophisticated piece of technology, a direct encrypted line to the highest levels of their global operation. "I think," she said calmly, "that it's time we discuss this with someone else." The appearance of the satellite phone created a momentary pause in the confrontation, a jarring disconnect that caught both Amanda and Miguel off guard. This sophisticated technology seemed utterly out of place with the elderly couple's modest appearance, another clue that their initial assessment might be fundamentally flawed. Palmer watched the interaction with growing interest, sensing that the situation was about to take an unexpected turn. The quiet confidence with which Josephine handled the satellite phone suggested resources and connections that belied the simple attire that had triggered Amanda and Miguel's dismissive response. In that moment of confusion, the balance of power in the cramped galley began to shift, imperceptible at first, but gathering momentum like an aircraft beginning its takeoff roll, slow initially, but building inexorably toward a point of no return. In a state-of-the-art office on the top floor of Horizon Airways headquarters in Atlanta, Chief Operations Officer Thomas Wilson sat bolt upright in his chair. The call from Josephine Blackwood had sent a jolt of adrenaline through his system that no amount of coffee could match. At 52, Wilson had spent 30 years in aviation operations, working his way up from a ramp agent loading baggage to one of the most powerful positions in the company. He had managed emergency landings, navigated the chaos of snowstorms that shut down hub airports, and coordinated aircraft repositioning during major system disruptions. He was by nature and experience unflappable. But the image of Walter and Josephine Blackwood, the revered founders of the airline people who had given him his first executive role and treated him like family, standing in a galley while their own flight prepared for departure, sent his heart rate spiking like an aircraft in an emergency climb. "In the galley?" He repeated, his voice a mixture of confusion and horror. "Why aren't you in your seats?" "That is the substance of my call," Josephine explained with remarkable composure. "According to the lead flight attendant, a Ms. Amanda Whitley, and the purser, a Mr. Miguel Rodriguez, we do not fit the profile for passengers in the Heritage Suites. They have refused to honor our boarding passes and have relegated us to the galley while they sort out the situation. They've offered to find us seats in Business Premier instead." Wilson closed his eyes briefly, processing the magnitude of what he was hearing. In his 3 decades in aviation, he had never encountered a situation quite like this one, the founders of an airline being denied their rightful seats because they didn't look the part. "This is unacceptable," he said, his voice low and controlled, but with an undercurrent of fury. "I'll handle it immediately. Please stay on the line." He pressed a button on his console that connected him directly to the operations center. "This is Wilson. I need an immediate ground hold on Flight 101 at JFK. Priority override executive authority. And get me a direct line to the captain now." Wilson's decisive action set in motion a cascade of events that would reverberate throughout the airline. In the operations center, controllers scrambled to implement the ground hold, puzzled by the unprecedented intervention from the COO himself, but trained to respond without question to such high-level directives. In the cockpit of Flight 101, Captain Diane Rivera was reviewing final departure clearances when her communications panel lit up with an urgent message from operations. She scanned the text, her professional composure momentarily slipping as she read the terse directive: immediate ground hold by executive authority. Founders of airline being denied seats in Premier cabin. Investigate and resolve. Rivera had been with Horizon for 22 years, rising through the ranks to command the prestigious transatlantic routes. She knew the Blackwood name, of course. Every employee did. Their portraits hung in the headquarters lobby, and their story was part of the company's onboarding narrative. But like many employees, she had never met them personally and had assumed they were no longer actively involved with the airline's operations. The idea that they might be aboard her aircraft being denied their rightful seats was almost incomprehensible. She immediately unstrapped from her seat. "I need to check something in the cabin," she told her first officer. "Monitor communications. We're on a ground hold." Back in Atlanta, Wilson had initiated a series of emergency protocols designed to address the situation from multiple angles. He dispatched the JFK station manager to the aircraft with instructions to personally ensure the Blackwoods were seated properly. He alerted security to be prepared for possible crew changes, and he contacted the SVP of In-Flight Services to brief her on the unfolding situation. In the galley of Flight 101, Josephine was still on the satellite phone, calmly relaying updates to Wilson. "Thomas is handling this directly," she told Walter. "The aircraft is on a ground hold until we're properly seated." Walter nodded, unsurprised by the swift response. Thomas Wilson had been one of their most promising executives, decisive, fair-minded, and uncompromising when it came to the airline's core values. Those were precisely the qualities that had led them to promote him to the C-suite before stepping back from daily operations. Miguel and Amanda, however, were entirely unaware of the forces being mobilized against them. They were still operating under the assumption that they were managing a routine case of passengers attempting to access accommodations beyond their station, a situation they had handled many times before without consequence. "I need to continue with the boarding process," Amanda said, her tone making it clear that her patience was exhausted. "If you're not willing to accept the business premier seating, I'll have to escalate this to the captain." "That won't be necessary," said a new voice from the galley entrance. "I'm already here." Captain Rivera stood framed in the doorway, her uniform impeccable, her expression a mixture of professional control and barely contained fury. Her gaze swept the scene, taking in the Blackwoods standing calmly with the satellite phone, Miguel and Amanda looking surprised and defensive, and Richard Palmer watching the unfolding drama with evident interest. "Captain," Miguel began, automatically straightening his posture. "We've been trying to resolve a seating issue with these passengers. They've been assigned seats in the Heritage Suites, but what?" Rivera interrupted, her voice sharp. "I've just received a direct communication from Atlanta about this situation. Am I to understand that you've denied these passengers access to their assigned seats because you don't believe they belong in the premier cabin?" The directness of the question left no room for evasion. Miguel looked to Amanda, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his face for the first time. Amanda stepped forward, her confidence still intact but with a growing edge of defensiveness. "Captain, these passengers don't match the typical profile for the Heritage Suites. We were concerned there might have been a booking error and were trying to find a suitable alternative." "A booking error," Rivera repeated, her tone making it clear what she thought of this explanation. "And did you verify their boarding passes? Check the manifest." "Yes, but..." "And did their names appear on the manifest for seats 1A and 1B? "Yes, Captain, but given their appearance..." Rivera held up a hand, cutting off the explanation. "Let me be absolutely clear about something. A passenger's appearance is never grounds for questioning their seating assignment when they have valid documentation." She turned to the Blackwoods, her demeanor shifting to one of profound respect. "Mr. and Mrs. Blackwood, on behalf of Horizon Airways, I want to personally apologize for this inexcusable situation. Please allow me to escort you to your seats immediately." The use of the Blackwood name sent a visible shock through Amanda and Miguel. For the first time, the possibility that these simply dressed elderly passengers might not be confused upgrade recipients, but people of significance within the airline itself began to penetrate their assumptions. "Blackwood," Miguel repeated, his voice suddenly uncertain. As in the founders and majority shareholders of this airline." Rivera confirmed her tone, leaving no doubt about the magnitude of their error. The very people whose names are on your paychecks. The revelation fell like a thunderbolt in the cramped galley, electrifying the air with its implications. Amanda's face drained of color, the full, catastrophic reality of her misjudgment finally breaking through her certainty. Miguel seemed to physically diminish his shoulders, slumping as he absorbed the career-ending significance of what had just transpired. Richard Palmer, who had inserted himself into the situation out of a sense of fairness rather than any knowledge of the Blackwoods' identity, now stood in stunned silence, realizing he had unwittingly taken part in a much more consequential confrontation than he had imagined. "Captain Rivera," Walter said, his voice calm despite the chaos swirling around him. "We appreciate your intervention. We would indeed like to take our seats now." Rivera nodded, then turned back to Amanda and Miguel. "You are both relieved of duty for this flight. You will take seats in the crew rest area for the duration of the journey and disembark in London under supervision. Further action will be determined upon our arrival." Her tone left no room for appeal or discussion. It was not a disciplinary measure, but a simple statement of fact. Their authority on this aircraft had been revoked, effective immediately. As Walter and Josephine followed Captain Rivera out of the galley and back into the premier cabin, the contrast could not have been more stark. Minutes earlier, they had been escorted away as interlopers, their presence deemed inappropriate for the rarefied air of first class. Now they returned with the captain of the aircraft personally leading them, their right to be there confirmed not by their appearance or attire, but by their identity. An identity that transcended and ultimately shattered the superficial judgments that had been made about them. The other passengers watched in stunned silence, piecing together the implications of what they were witnessing. The elderly couple that had been so dismissively removed was now being treated with profound deference by the captain herself. Something significant had occurred, something that had upended the usual power dynamics of the premium cabin. As they settled into the heritage suites that bore their name, a subtle tribute to the airline's origins that only a few employees truly understood, Walter and Josephine exchanged a glance that contained decades of shared experience. They had faced similar treatment many times throughout their lives and careers, but this instance held a special irony, being judged unworthy of the very spaces they had created. The incident aboard Flight 101 might have remained a personal humiliation, an unfortunate experience to be endured and then put aside. But as the aircraft finally began to push back from the gate nearly 30 minutes behind schedule, the Blackwoods were already considering how this moment might serve a larger purpose, how it might become a catalyst for examining and addressing patterns of behavior that affected not just them, but countless passengers who lacked the power to command ground holds and direct interventions from corporate headquarters. In that consideration lay the seeds of a transformation that would eventually touch every aspect of Horizon Airways, from its training protocols to its corporate culture to its fundamental understanding of what truly premium service entailed. The Horizon Airways Global Operations Center in Atlanta hummed with controlled urgency. The vast room, with its blue-tinted lighting and wall-to-wall displays, was designed to manage the complex choreography of a global airline's movements. Hundreds of aircraft, thousands of crew members, and tens of thousands of passengers moving across continents in a carefully coordinated dance. Now that choreography was being disrupted by a single flight that hadn't even left the ground. The red emergency light continued to pulse at multiple workstations, signaling the executive override that had placed Flight 101 under Thomas Wilson's direct control. The unusual nature of the situation had created a ripple of focused activity across the operations floor. "Ground hold confirmed for 101, called out Jessica Morales, the lead dispatcher for transatlantic routes. Her fingers flew across her keyboard as she coordinated with JFK ground control. "Tower is requesting a reason for the delay. Security protocol verification," Wilson directed from his elevated office. "No further details required." On the massive central display that dominated the front wall, Flight 101's status indicator had changed from green on time to yellow delayed. In the complex ecosystem of a hub airport like JFK, even a single delayed departure could trigger a cascade of scheduling adjustments. Already, operations specialists were calculating the impact on connecting passengers' crew duty times and the aircraft's subsequent flights. Wilson strode onto the operations floor, his presence immediately drawing attention. The COO rarely left his office during a developing situation unless it was of the highest priority. His expression was composed but intense, the look of a man navigating a crisis with both urgency and precision. "I need a direct line to corporate security at Heathrow," he instructed the International Operations Coordinator. "Have them standing by for the arrival of 101. I'll brief them personally in 30 minutes. He turned to another specialist managing crew scheduling. "I need profiles on all flight attendants and flight deck crew for 101, particularly lead flight attendant Amanda Whitley and purser Miguel Rodriguez. Full employment history, performance reviews, passenger complaints, commendations, everything we have. Priority access, my eyes only." Wilson's desk phone rang, the dedicated line used only for the most sensitive communications. He picked it up immediately. "Wilson?" "Sir, this is Ellen Doherty at Gate B22. I'm with corporate security officers Barnes and Jimenez. We're preparing to board." "Good," Wilson replied. "Here's the situation. Walter and Josephine Blackwood are in the forward galley being prevented from accessing their assigned seats in the Heritage Suites. Lead flight attendant Whitley and purser Rodriguez are the primary individuals involved. Captain Rivera has been informed and should be addressing the situation as we speak. Your job is to ensure the Blackwoods are treated with the utmost respect and to facilitate any actions Captain Rivera deems necessary regarding crew changes." "Understood, sir." Doherty responded, her voice steady despite the high-stakes situation. "And if the crew members in question resist, they won't be given that option. This is not a discussion or a negotiation. It's a direct order from this office. Any resistance will result in immediate suspension and removal from the aircraft." As Wilson hung up, his deputy approached with a concerned expression. "Thomas, we're getting questions from scheduling about the cascading delays. This hold is going to impact at least 6 other departures and potentially some international connections." Wilson nodded, acknowledging the operational complexity but unwavering in his priorities. "Make the adjustments. Delay subsequent flights as needed, protect the connections. This takes precedence over schedule integrity." His deputy hesitated. "May I ask what's happening? The override code you used is reserved for security threats or severe safety issues." Wilson looked around the operations center, aware of the dozens of professionals working to maintain the intricate dance of global aviation. Most of them had never met Walter or Josephine. Blackwood had never experienced directly the vision and values that had built their company. But all of them were affected by the culture those founders had created, or had attempted to create. "What's happening," Wilson said quietly, "is a fundamental failure of our service culture. The founders of our airline are being denied seats they paid for because they don't look the part. That's not just a customer service issue. It's a betrayal of everything this company stands for." The deputy's eyes widened slightly as the implications registered. "The Blackwoods are on that flight being denied seats." "Yes, and while the immediate situation will be resolved, the underlying issue won't be fixed by simply removing 2 employees. This points to something deeper, a drift from our founding principles that we need to address comprehensively." As Wilson returned to coordinating the response, he was already thinking beyond the immediate crisis. The incident aboard Flight 101 would have consequences, not just for Amanda Whitley and Miguel Rodriguez, but for how Horizon Airways understood and executed its commitment to treating all passengers with dignity and respect, regardless of appearance or status. The operational disruption would be temporary, measured in minutes and hours. But the cultural transformation that would emerge from this incident would reshape the airline for years to come, touching everything from hiring and training to performance evaluation and promotion criteria. It would become known throughout the company as the moment when Horizon Airways rediscovered its soul, or at least began the journey back to the principles upon which it had been founded. As Flight 101 finally received clearance to push back from the gate, the focus in the operations center shifted to the next phase of the response, preparing for the aircraft's arrival in London and the formal proceedings that would follow. But in Thomas Wilson's mind, a different kind of preparation was already underway, planning not just for the aftermath of this specific incident, but for the more challenging work of examining and addressing the cultural conditions that had allowed it to occur. The walk from the cockpit to the forward galley of the Skymaster 900 was approximately 30 feet. For Captain Diane Rivera, it felt like a mile-long march into a disaster zone of her crew's making. The responsibility for everything that happened on her aircraft, from the engines to the cabin service, was ultimately hers. A catastrophic failure of respect and protocol had occurred on her watch under her command, and she was about to face the consequences directly. As she stepped out of the cockpit, the first person she encountered was Miguel Rodriguez, who was standing guard at the entrance to the premier cabin like a sentry. His eyes widened at the sight of the captain leaving her post during pre-departure procedures, an almost unprecedented occurrence that signaled the gravity of the situation. "Captain," he began, uncertainty evident in his voice. "Is there a problem?" Rivera fixed him with a stare that made the seasoned purser take an involuntary step back. "That's what I'm here to find out, Mr. Rodriguez. I've just received an emergency communication from the COO himself regarding 2 passengers named Blackwood, who should be in the Heritage Suites, but are apparently being held in the galley. Would you care to explain?" Miguel's face, which had been a mask of authoritative confidence moments earlier, drained of color. The name Blackwood, connected with a direct communication from the COO, sent a jolt of recognition through him, but he still didn't make the full connection. "It's a routine seating issue, Captain. An elderly couple who insisted they were in the Heritage Suites. They didn't seem... they weren't dressed. We thought it was a booking error." Rivera's expression hardened further. "A routine seating issue that triggered an emergency ground hold from Atlanta. Show me their boarding passes." Miguel handed over the boarding passes with a slightly trembling hand. Rivera scanned them quickly, noting the names, the seat assignments, and the full-fare first-class designation. There was nothing unusual or ambiguous about the documents. They clearly entitled Walter and Josephine Blackwood to seats 1A and 1B. "And you verified these against the manifest?" she asked, her voice dangerously quiet. "Yes, Captain. The names matched, but we thought..." "You thought what exactly?" Rivera's tone was razor-sharp. "That despite having valid boarding passes for seats that appeared on the manifest under their names, these passengers should be denied their seats because of how they were dressed." Before Miguel could formulate a response, Rivera pushed past him toward the galley. What she found there confirmed her worst fears: Walter and Josephine Blackwood, whose photographs hung in the headquarters lobby alongside a timeline of the airline's history, standing calmly amid the stainless steel counters and service carts, while Amanda Whitley arranged welcome drinks as if nothing unusual were occurring. The disconnect between the mundane pre-flight activities and the extraordinary situation unfolding was jarring. These weren't just any passengers being inconvenienced. They were aviation pioneers who had built Horizon Airways from a single cargo plane into a global carrier with hundreds of aircraft and tens of thousands of employees. And they were being treated like confused interlopers who had wandered into the wrong section of the plane. Rivera took a deep breath, centering herself before addressing the founders of the company that had employed her for over 2 decades. "Mr. and Mrs. Blackwood." She began, her voice thick with a sincerity born of professional shame and genuine respect. "I am Captain Diane Rivera. I want to offer you my deepest, most profound apology for what you have experienced on my aircraft today. There are no excuses for the treatment you have received. It is a failure of training, a failure of leadership, my leadership, and a failure of basic human decency. I am deeply and truly sorry." Walter Blackwood studied her face, his eyes sharp and assessing behind his wire-rimmed glasses. After a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, he gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod. Not forgiveness, perhaps, but acknowledgement of her sincerity. "Thank you, Captain. We appreciate that. We know this is not a reflection on you personally," Josephine replied, her graciousness in the face of such treatment striking Rivera forcefully. Rivera's shoulders sagged with a small measure of relief at their response, but she knew that expressions of regret were insufficient. Action was required. "I have been in direct communication with the operations center," she continued, her voice regaining some of its command presence. "The employees responsible for this incident will be addressed. But first, please allow me to escort you to your seats." She personally took Josephine's tote bag and Walter's satchel, and with a gesture invited them to precede her out of the galley. As they stepped back into the premier cabin, a hush fell over the space. The passengers, who had been whispering and surreptitiously watching the galley entrance, fell silent at the sight of the captain herself escorting the elderly couple they had earlier seen being questioned and removed. Amanda, emerging from the galley behind them, froze as she registered what was happening. "Captain," she said, her voice sharp with confusion and the beginning of alarm. "What's going on?" "These are the passengers I told you about. There's been a seating." Rivera turned to face her, cutting off the explanation with a raised hand. "Ms. Whitley?" she said, her voice low but carrying clearly through the now silent cabin. "Your service on this flight is terminated effective immediately." Amanda stared at her, utterly dumbfounded. "What? You can't be serious. On what grounds?" "On the grounds of gross misconduct, dereliction of duty, and for causing a major incident by harassing the founders and majority shareholders of this airline." Rivera bit out each word like a separate indictment. The color drained from Amanda's face as she looked from the captain's stern expression to the calm, implacable faces of Walter and Josephine Blackwood, now being seated in 1A and 1B. The truth in all its career-ending horror finally dawned on her. The worn tweed jacket, the simple dress, the lack of ostentation. These weren't signs of people who didn't belong in first class. They were the ultimate symbols of a power so vast, so secure, that it had no need for external validation. She had not been policing a boundary. She had been insulting the very founders of her professional universe. Her mouth opened, but no sound emerged. Rivera was not finished. She turned to Miguel, who had been hovering nearby, his face a mask of dawning terror. "Mr. Rodriguez, you are also relieved of your duties. You will both take seats in the crew rest area in the rear of the aircraft. You will not speak to any passengers. You will not communicate with other crew members except as absolutely necessary for safety purposes. You will disembark in London under the supervision of corporate security. Is that understood?" Miguel nodded mutely, his entire body seeming to shrink under the weight of his professional disgrace. Amanda finally found her voice a high-pitched sound of pure panic. "Please, Captain, it was a mistake. A simple misunderstanding. I didn't know who they were." "How could I have known?" Walter Blackwood spoke for the first time since re-entering the cabin. His voice was low and resonant, carrying easily to every corner of the suddenly silent space. "Young lady," he said, looking directly at Amanda. "You are correct. You didn't know who we were. That is precisely the problem. You should not need to know who people are to treat them with respect and dignity. You have failed that most basic test of human decency." His words, delivered without anger but with the quiet authority of absolute conviction, were a devastating epitaph for Amanda's career. The simple truth they contained seemed to echo in the confined space of the aircraft cabin, reaching every passenger and crew member with undeniable clarity. Rivera turned to Sophia, who had been watching the exchange with wide, horrified eyes. "Ms. Hernandez, you are now the lead attendant for this cabin. Please ensure all passengers are properly settled for departure." "Yes, Captain." Sophia responded, her voice barely audible as the enormity of the situation and her sudden promotion registered. Rivera then turned back to the Blackwoods, who were now seated in their rightful places. "Mr. and Mrs. Blackwood, is there anything specific you require before I return to the flight deck?" "Just a prompt departure, Captain," Walter replied with remarkable equanimity given the circumstances. "I believe we've delayed your schedule long enough." As Rivera returned to the cockpit to resume the departure sequence that had been interrupted by the incident, she reflected on the lessons of the past 15 minutes. In her decades as a pilot, she had faced mechanical failures, extreme weather, and medical emergencies, all manageable through training and procedure. But this incident revealed a different kind of failure, one that no technical manual could address: the failure to see the basic humanity in others, regardless of their appearance. It was a lesson she would carry with her long after Flight 101 crossed the Atlantic, one that would reshape her understanding of leadership and redefine her role in upholding the values upon which Horizon Airways had been built. The atmosphere in the premier cabin had transformed entirely. What had been a space of practiced luxury and entitlement was now charged with the electric current of witnessing consequences unfold in real time. The passengers who moments earlier had been settling into their expected routines of champagne and hot towels were now rapt audience members to a drama none of them had anticipated. At the center of this drama stood Walter and Josephine Blackwood, now properly seated in the Heritage Suites, but still the focus of furtive glances and whispered conversations. Their simple attire and understated demeanor, the very qualities that had triggered Amanda's dismissive response, now seemed to radiate an authentic authority that made the ostentatious displays of wealth around them appear somehow hollow and performative. Sophia Hernandez moved through the cabin with nervous energy, her previous confidence shaken by the sudden promotion and the weight of serving the airline's founders. Despite her anxiety, she approached her duties with genuine warmth and attention, treating all passengers, not just the Blackwoods, with equal respect and consideration. This shift in service style was subtle but noticeable. Where Amanda had performed a kind of theatrical deference toward those she deemed worthy, Sophia simply provided attentive, thoughtful service to everyone, regardless of their appearance or demeanor. The result was a more relaxed, authentic atmosphere that several passengers noted with quiet appreciation. Richard Palmer, who had inserted himself into the confrontation out of a sense of fairness, rather than any knowledge of the Blackwoods' identity, now found himself in an unexpected position. As the aircraft prepared for takeoff, he leaned slightly across the aisle toward Walter. "Mr. Blackwood," he said, his voice low enough to remain private. "I want to apologize for what happened. Not for speaking up. That seemed necessary. But for the fact that it was necessary at all. You shouldn't have needed someone to intercede. Your valid tickets should have been enough." Walter turned toward him, studying the younger man with thoughtful eyes. "There's no need to apologize, Mr. Palmer. Your willingness to question what you perceived as unfair treatment speaks well of your character. Most people find it easier to remain silent in such situations. Maybe too many of us have remained silent for too long." Palmer replied, a note of self-reflection in his voice. "It's easier to look away to pretend we don't see the small injustices that happen around us every day." Walter nodded, appreciation evident in his expression. "That observation shows considerable insight. The most pervasive forms of discrimination persist not because of the actions of a few, but because of the silence of many." Their conversation was interrupted as Sophia appeared with the pre-takeoff beverage service. "Mr. Blackwood, Mrs. Blackwood," she said, her nervousness evident but her manner warm. "Would you care for champagne or perhaps something else before we depart?" "Water would be fine, thank you," Josephine replied with a gentle smile that helped ease some of Sophia's tension. As Sophia served their drinks, Walter observed her carefully. Despite her obvious anxiety, she was handling her sudden promotion with admirable composure, maintaining professional service while navigating the emotionally charged atmosphere of the cabin. "You're doing very well, Ms. Hernandez," he said quietly as she handed him his water, "especially under difficult circumstances." Sophia's eyes widened slightly at the direct acknowledgement. "Thank you, sir. I'm trying my best." "That's all any of us can do," Walter replied, "and sometimes our best is exactly what's needed." The simple encouragement delivered without condescension or excessive familiarity helped settle Sophia's nerves. She continued her service with growing confidence, moving through the cabin with a more natural rhythm as she adjusted to her unexpected role. Meanwhile, in the rear of the aircraft, Amanda Whitley and Miguel Rodriguez sat in stunned silence in the crew rest area, their careers imploding in real time. A security officer sat nearby, not engaging with them but monitoring their compliance with Captain Rivera's directive to remain separated from the rest of the crew and passengers. Amanda's thoughts whirled in chaotic patterns of denial, anger, and nascent fear. How could this be happening to her? She had been following the unwritten rules, maintaining the standards that had always been expected. She had done what any lead flight attendant would do when confronted with passengers who didn't match the profile for the heritage suites. How was she supposed to know they were the founders of the airline? Yet even as these defensive thoughts circled, a small voice was beginning to penetrate her denial. A voice asking uncomfortable questions about why appearance had become her primary criterion for judging who belonged in premium spaces, about why she had been so quick to assume that an elderly black couple in simple clothing couldn't possibly have legitimately purchased first-class tickets. Miguel's mental state was different. The initial shock had given way to a clearer recognition of what had occurred. He had participated in discriminatory behavior that contradicted both official policy and basic human decency. The fact that the targets of this discrimination happened to be the founders of the airline was not the core issue. It was the discriminatory behavior itself that was indefensible. This realization brought no comfort, but did provide a kind of clarity that Amanda had not yet reached. Miguel understood that there would be no appealing the consequences of their actions, no convincing explanation that would restore their positions. They had failed a fundamental test of character, and that failure would reshape their professional lives in ways they were only beginning to comprehend. As the Skymaster 900 finally lifted off from JFK nearly 40 minutes behind schedule, the incident that had delayed its departure continued to reverberate throughout the cabin. Passengers who had witnessed the confrontation found themselves reflecting on their own responses, or lack thereof. Some, like Richard Palmer, had chosen to speak up. Others had remained silent observers. A few had tacitly endorsed Amanda and Miguel's actions through their expressions of annoyance or amusement. Now knowing the identity of the couple at the center of the incident, many of these passengers experienced a recalibration of their perspectives. What did it mean that they might have felt differently had they known who the Blackwoods were? What did that reveal about their own tendencies to judge based on appearance rather than substance? For Walter and Josephine Blackwood seated comfortably in the heritage suites as the aircraft climbed to cruising altitude, these questions were familiar territory. Throughout their long lives and careers, they had repeatedly encountered people whose treatment of them shifted dramatically once their identity and status became known. They had learned to use these moments not just as personal affronts, but as opportunities to expose and address deeper patterns of behavior. As Sophia approached with warm towels once the seatbelt sign was turned off, Josephine accepted hers with a thoughtful expression. "Ms. Hernandez," she said, "may I ask how long you've been with Horizon?" "Almost 18 months, ma'am," Sophia replied, surprised by the personal question. "And in that time, have you observed similar situations to what occurred today? Not necessarily involving us, but other passengers being judged based on appearance?" Sophia hesitated, caught between professional discretion and honest response. The expectant silence from Josephine made it clear that a genuine answer was expected. "Yes, ma'am," she admitted finally. "Not usually as extreme, but yes." There are unwritten rules about who looks like they belong in premium cabins and who doesn't. It's never stated in our training, but it's communicated in other ways, through example, through praise and criticism, through comments made in the galley. Josephine nodded, unsurprised by the confirmation of what she and Walter had suspected. Thank you for your honesty. It's important for us to understand not just what happened today, but the broader patterns that allowed it to occur. And the incident aboard Flight 101 was no longer just about two elderly passengers being denied their rightful seats. It had become a window into cultural patterns that affected countless passengers who lacked the power to command emergency ground holds or direct interventions from corporate headquarters. In that recognition lay the seeds of a transformation that would eventually touch every aspect of Horizon Airways, from its hiring and training practices to its performance metrics to its fundamental understanding of what constituted truly premium service. As the aircraft leveled off at cruising altitude and the cabin service routine began in earnest, Walter and Josephine exchanged a glance that contained decades of shared experience. They had faced discrimination many times throughout their lives, but this instance held a special significance and opportunity. As founders and majority shareholders of Horizon Airways, they had the power not just to address this specific incident, but to initiate a comprehensive examination of the company culture, to ensure that the dignity-centered principles upon which they had built the airline were truly being practiced throughout its operations. That opportunity would shape the remainder of their journey and the actions they would take upon returning to Atlanta, actions that would ultimately transform not just Horizon Airways, but influence service standards throughout the aviation industry and beyond. The Skymaster 900 touched down at London's Heathrow Airport with the precision that characterized Horizon Airways operations. As the aircraft taxied toward its designated stand, passengers began the familiar routine of gathering belongings and preparing for disembarkation. But it quickly became apparent that this would not be a routine arrival. Through the windows, passengers noticed that they were not approaching the familiar bustling gates of Terminal 3, but being guided to a remote stand on the airfield's perimeter, a location typically used for special situations requiring privacy or security. On the tarmac below, a scene of somber importance awaited. 3 black Range Rovers sat with engines idling their polished surfaces reflecting the gray London sky. Beside them stood a small delegation in dark suits, their posture and alertness marking them as more than ordinary airport staff. Leading this delegation was Jonathan Mercer, London Station Manager for Horizon Airways, and a 20-year veteran of the airline's European operations. Normally unflappable Mercer now exhibited the tense focus of a man navigating a high-stakes situation. He had been briefed directly by Thomas Wilson on the events aboard Flight 101, and understood both the immediate priorities and the broader implications. Captain Rivera's voice came over the aircraft's public address system, her tone professional but with an undercurrent of gravity. Ladies and gentlemen, we have arrived at London Heathrow. For our passengers in the Heritage Suites, we will be disembarking you first via the forward stairs. For all other passengers, we will then proceed to our gate for normal deplaning. Please remain seated until the main cabin door is open. The use of the formal suite name, a clear address to the Blackwoods, was a final public act of deference, a signal to the entire aircraft that these particular passengers were being accorded special treatment for a reason. In the crew rest area at the rear of the aircraft, Amanda and Miguel received their own instructions via the interphone. The security officer who had monitored them throughout the flight answered the call, listened briefly, then turned to them. You will remain seated until all passengers have disembarked, he informed them. You will then be escorted from the aircraft via the rear stairs. Your luggage will be removed from the crew storage and delivered to you on the ground. You are not to communicate with any other crew members or passengers during this process. Both nodded mutely, the final humiliation of their separate removal, cementing the reality of their professional disgrace. Throughout the flight, Amanda had cycled through denial, anger, and bargaining. Now, as the wheels touched British soil, the weight of acceptance settled upon her shoulders like a lead cloak. This was happening. This was real. Her career with Horizon Airways was over. Miguel had reached that conclusion hours earlier and had spent much of the flight in silent contemplation of what had led him to this moment. Not just the immediate misjudgment of the Blackwoods, but the gradual hardening of attitudes and assumptions that had made such a misjudgment possible. This realization brought no comfort, but did provide a kind of clarity that Amanda had not yet reached. Miguel understood that there would be no appealing the consequences of their actions, no convincing explanation that would restore their positions. They had failed a fundamental test of character, and that failure would reshape their professional lives in ways they were only beginning to comprehend. At the front of the aircraft, Captain Rivera emerged from the cockpit and personally escorted Walter and Josephine to the door. She walked with them down the mobile stairs onto the tarmac, the gray London sky spitting a light drizzle that seemed appropriate to the solemnity of the moment. "Mr. and Mrs. Blackwood," she said, shaking both their hands firmly. "I hope that one day you will consider flying with me again so I can provide you with the exemplary service you have always deserved." "You are a fine captain, Diane," Walter replied, his voice carrying a note of genuine respect. "This airline is better for having you. It is your crew that needs to meet your standard." With that final assessment, they were handed over to the waiting Jonathan Mercer, who greeted them with profound respect. "Mr. and Mrs. Blackwood, on behalf of Horizon Airways London operation, I want to extend our deepest apologies for the treatment you received aboard Flight 101. I've arranged for immediate transportation to your hotel, and Mr. Wilson has requested a secure conference line be established for you as soon as you're settled." Walter nodded, acknowledging the efficient arrangements without unnecessary commentary. As they moved toward the lead Range Rover, he glanced back at the aircraft they had just left, at the Horizon Airways livery that bore their influence, at the brand they had built from nothing over 6 decades of work. His expression was not angry, but thoughtful, the look of a man considering not just what had happened, but what it revealed about the company he had created. Meanwhile, a white van with the Horizon logo had pulled up to the rear service stairs. 2 members of corporate security, both with the alert posture and discreet earpieces that marked their function, ascended into the plane to retrieve Amanda and Miguel. The walk of shame that followed was brief but excruciating. They were escorted down the rear stairs, a path normally used for catering and cleaning crews emerging onto the tarmac far from the passenger exit. Ground staff paused in their work to watch this unusual procession. 2 uniformed crew members being led by security toward a waiting van rather than the crew transport that would take their colleagues to the hotel. Inside the van, Jonathan Mercer awaited them, his earlier anxiety now replaced by the cold professionalism of a manager executing an unpleasant but necessary task. "Before we begin," he said, his voice clipped and formal, "I am legally required to inform you that this conversation is being recorded for the official record of your termination proceedings." He then read from a prepared statement, his words precise and without emotion. "Amanda Whitley, a review of your service record and the evidence from Flight 101 has shown behavior in violation of Articles 14, 21, and 38 of your employment contract, which explicitly forbid discrimination, harassment, and actions that cause significant brand and reputational damage. Miguel Rodriguez, your failure to intervene and your active complicity in these actions constitute a dereliction of your duties as a senior cabin purser. Therefore, on the authority of the chairman of the board and the office of the COO, your employment with Horizon Airways is terminated effective immediately." Amanda's last defenses crumbled. "No, please," she pleaded, her voice cracking. "It was a mistake, a single mistake. In 17 years, I have perfect reviews commendations. I built my life around this job." Mercer's expression remained impassive. "Your performance reviews are irrelevant. You could have been the employee of the century. It would not matter. You failed the one test that is not graded on a curve: character." He held out his hand. "Your company identification, airport access cards, company-issued tablets, and uniform allotment cards. Surrender them now." One of the security officers held out a clear plastic bag. Miguel complied without protest, dropping his items in with a shaking hand. Amanda hesitated, clutching her ID badge, the symbol of her professional identity for nearly 2 decades. "Please," she whispered, "don't do this." The security officer took a step forward. "Ma'am, do not make this more difficult than it needs to be." Humiliated, she finally relinquished her ID, the card that had granted her access to a world she had worked so hard to join. It clattered into the bag, the sound of a door closing permanently. They were then subjected to a brief search of their carry-on bags to ensure no company property remained in their possession. The systematic dismantling of their professional identities continued with mechanical efficiency. Forms signed, personal belongings separated from company property, final communications delivered without warmth or mitigation. The van drove them not to the terminal but to a service gate on the airport's far perimeter. The door slid open to reveal a gray, drizzling London afternoon. "You will exit here," the security officer said. "A taxi can be called from the service road." Amanda and Miguel stumbled out onto the wet pavement, their rolling suitcases looking absurdly out of place in the industrial surroundings. They stood there, 2 disgraced former employees on a lonely curb, and watched as the white van drove away without a backward glance, leaving them alone with the wreckage of their professional lives. After several minutes of stunned silence, Miguel spoke first. "I'll call a taxi," he said, his voice hollow. "We should find a hotel." Amanda nodded mutely, still unable to fully process the swift and absolute destruction of the career she had spent 17 years building. As Miguel stepped away to make the call, she looked down at her uniform, still perfect despite the circumstances, still bearing the gold wings that had been her greatest source of pride. Now those wings felt like a mockery, a reminder of how far and how fast she had fallen. The rain fell harder, soaking through their uniforms as they waited for the taxi. Neither spoke again. There was nothing to say. They had been judged, found wanting, and removed, not just from a flight or a job, but from identities that had defined them for years. The private terminal at Heathrow Airport existed in a parallel universe to the crowded halls of the main concourses. Here, affluence purchased not just comfort, but invisibility, the freedom to arrive and depart without navigating the communal experience of commercial aviation. Walter and Josephine Blackwood sat in a private lounge, the rain-streaked windows overlooking the distant runways where aircraft landed and departed in a constant rhythm. Though they had used this facility many times over the decades today, it felt different. A reminder of the separate worlds that existed within the ecosystem they had helped create. Thomas Wilson's face appeared on the secure tablet before them, his expression a mixture of contrition and determination. "Walter, Josephine," he began, "words cannot express my personal shame and regret for what you experienced. It represents a fundamental failure at every level." Walter nodded, his expression thoughtful rather than angry. "The failure wasn't with your immediate response, Thomas. You acted decisively and appropriately. The failure was that it happened at all, that we've created an environment where such behavior could develop and persist." Wilson accepted this assessment without defensiveness. "You're right, of course. The question is, where do we go from here? I've initiated immediate termination proceedings for Whitley and Rodriguez, as you know, but I think we both recognize this isn't just about 2 employees. "No," Josephine agreed, her voice calm but firm. "It's about the culture we've allowed to evolve. 2 people don't develop those attitudes in isolation. They're symptoms of a broader condition." The 3 fell silent for a moment, each contemplating the scale of the challenge before them. It wasn't simply a matter of disciplinary action or policy revision. It was about examining the heart of an organization that employed over 48,000 people across 5 continents. "I've called an emergency meeting of the executive leadership team," Wilson continued. 1400 hours Atlanta time. I've made it clear this isn't optional. Everyone from the CEO down will be present. I think," He hesitated, then pushed forward. "I think we need you there, Walter. Your voice carries a weight no one else's can." Walter exchanged a glance with Josephine, a silent consultation between partners who had faced countless decisions together. She gave him a small nod of encouragement. "I'll be there, Thomas," Walter agreed. Not to point fingers or assign blame, but to help chart a path forward. This incident has revealed a disconnect between our stated values and our operational reality. Addressing that gap will require more than disciplinary action. It will demand a fundamental recommitment to principles we may have taken for granted. As they concluded the call, a soft knock at the door announced the arrival of a terminal attendant. "Mr. and Mrs. Blackwood, your aircraft will be ready for boarding in approximately 45 minutes. Is there anything you require in the meantime?" "No, thank you," Walter replied. "We're quite comfortable." As the attendant withdrew, Walter turned to Josephine. "Before we return to Atlanta, there's someone I'd like to speak with. Someone whose perspective I think will be valuable in understanding what happened and how we might address it." Josephine nodded, immediately understanding his intention. "Sophia Hernandez." A few phone calls later, arrangements had been made. Sophia, who had expected to have a 24-hour layover in London before her return flight, was being brought to the private terminal. She had been told only that the Blackwoods wished to speak with her, not that this conversation might significantly alter the trajectory of her career. When she arrived, her nervousness was evident in the way she clutched her small purse and the darting glances she cast around the luxurious private lounge, a space she had never entered despite working for the airline. "Ms. Hernandez," Walter greeted her, rising from his seat with natural courtesy. "Thank you for coming. Please sit down." Sophia perched on the edge of an armchair, her posture reflecting her uncertainty about this unexpected meeting. "Mr. and Mrs. Blackwood," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "I want to apologize again for what happened. I should have—" Walter raised a hand gently. "We've already discussed your initial hesitation, Sophia. That's not why we asked you here." He settled back into his seat, studying her with kind but penetrating eyes. "We want to understand the culture that allowed this incident to happen, not just on this flight, but potentially throughout our airline." Sophia's eyes widened slightly. This was not what she had expected. Not a reprimand or reassurance, but an invitation to provide insight that might shape company policy. "Tell me," Walter continued, "was Amanda's behavior today unusual, or was it consistent with how she typically treats passengers she deems unsuitable for premium service?" The directness of the question created a moment of moral crisis for Sophia. To answer honestly might feel like betrayal of a colleague. To dissemble would betray the trust the Blackwoods were placing in her. After a moment of internal struggle, she chose truth. "It was consistent," she admitted. "There's an unwritten code about who belongs in the premier cabin and who doesn't. Amanda enforced that code rigidly. Passengers who didn't match her expectations received technically correct service, but none of the warmth or special attention reserved for those she considered real premium travelers." Walter nodded, not surprised, but clearly saddened by the confirmation. "And this code, it's based primarily on appearance, clothing, jewelry, how people carry themselves?" "Yes, mostly, but also race sometimes. Age, accent." Sophia looked down at her hands, uncomfortable with naming these truths aloud, but recognizing their importance. "It's never explicit. No one says treat this person differently because they're black or because they're not wearing expensive clothes. It's all conveyed through subtle cues. An eye roll, a certain tone, comments made later in the galley." Josephine leaned forward slightly. "And how widespread would you say this attitude is? Is it isolated to certain routes or teams, or is it more pervasive?" Sophia considered the question carefully. "It varies. Some crew members, like Captain Rivera, treat everyone with the same respect. Others follow Amanda's example, especially junior staff who want her approval or fear her disapproval. The transatlantic routes tend to be worse. There's more emphasis on exclusivity, on maintaining what Amanda called the premium experience. She hesitated, then added something that had been troubling her since the incident. The hardest part is that we're never explicitly told to discriminate. The training materials all talk about treating every passenger with respect. But then in practice, you're rewarded for giving special attention to certain passengers and criticized if you waste time on others. So you learn quickly what's really expected even though it contradicts the official values. This observation, the gap between stated principles and rewarded behaviors, seemed to particularly resonate with Walter. He nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. "Thank you for your candor, Sophia. It can't have been easy to discuss these matters, especially with the founders of your company." "It isn't," she admitted, "but it feels important. What happened to you was wrong, and it probably happens to other passengers who don't have the power to change things." Walter smiled, appreciating her moral clarity. "That's precisely the point. Josephine and I were treated poorly, but we had recourse, immediate decisive action that corrected the situation. Most passengers facing similar discrimination have no such power. They simply endure it, perhaps never flying with us again, perhaps telling others about their experience. The damage extends far beyond one interaction." He rose from his chair and moved to the window, looking out at the Horizon Airways aircraft visible on the distant tarmac. For a moment he seemed lost in thought, perhaps reflecting on the 6 decades of work that had gone into building the global enterprise now bearing his name. "Sophia," he said, turning back to her, "when we founded this airline, we made a simple promise to ourselves that we would create a company where everyone, passengers and employees alike, would be treated with dignity regardless of appearance or background. That promise came from our own experiences of being judged, dismissed, and excluded based on how we looked, rather than who we were." His voice took on a note of personal recollection. "I remember walking into a bank in 1968 wearing my best suit, which wasn't very good, to apply for our first business loan. The loan officer took one look at me and said, 'The janitorial applications are down the hall.' He didn't even consider that I might be a businessman seeking financing. That experience and countless others like it shaped our vision for Horizon Airways." Sophia listened intently, seeing the founders of her company not just as distant corporate figures, but as people who had faced the same kind of prejudice she had sometimes encountered in her own life. What happened on Flight 101 suggests that somewhere along the way that vision became clouded. Walter continued. "The practices that you've described, judging passengers based on appearance, providing different levels of service based on those judgments, directly contradict the principles upon which we built this airline." He returned to his seat, his expression now resolute rather than reflective. "Sophia, I'd like you to consider a new role, one that would involve helping us understand the gap between our stated values and our operational reality, particularly in premium service." Sophia's breath caught. "A new role? I'm not sure I understand." "Neither do I fully," Walter admitted with a small smile. "We're still formulating our response to today's events. But I know that any meaningful change will require insight from people at all levels of the organization, especially those who interact directly with passengers. Your perspective would be invaluable." Before Sophia could respond, Walter continued. "You don't need to answer now. Return to New York, complete your normal rotation. Someone from Thomas Wilson's office will contact you within the week with a more concrete proposal." As Sophia left the lounge, Walter returned to his seat beside Josephine. "What do you think?" he asked. "I think she has exactly the kind of moral clarity we need," Josephine replied. "Whether she has the confidence to act on it consistently remains to be seen. But today was revealing. Her character bent initially under pressure, but it didn't break." Walter nodded in agreement. "The coming weeks will be challenging. Examining entrenched attitudes, confronting uncomfortable truths, rebuilding what has been allowed to erode. None of it will be easy." "No," Josephine said, taking his hand. but nothing worthwhile ever is. When Sofia Hernandez returned to New York after the tumultuous events of Flight 101, she found herself in a strange limbo, still technically in her previous role but already set apart by her experience. Her fellow flight attendants regarded her with a mixture of curiosity, awe, and in some cases, thinly veiled resentment. "Is it true the Blackwoods were testing the crew on purpose?" asked Daniela as they prepared for a pre-flight briefing on what would be Sofia's final rotation before her reassignment. "No, they were just traveling like any other passengers," Sofia replied, uncomfortable with the speculation swirling around the incident. "But they must have known what would happen," pressed James, another flight attendant. "I mean, dressing down like that in first class. They had to be looking for trouble." Sofia frowned at this characterization, which subtly shifted blame from Amanda and Miguel to the Blackwoods themselves. "I don't think they were looking for trouble. I think they were just being themselves. From what I could tell, that's just how they dress." This simple statement, that billionaire airline founders might genuinely prefer comfort over ostentation, seemed to perplex her colleagues more than any other aspect of the story. It contradicted everything they had absorbed about how wealth and power were supposed to manifest themselves. During her final flights, Sofia found herself hyper-aware of her own interactions with passengers. She noticed the subtle ways service differed between cabins, the unconscious assumptions that shaped how crew members responded to different passengers, the unwritten codes that determined who received warmth versus mere technical courtesy. What had once seemed normal now appeared as a complex system of judgment that had little to do with providing excellent service. The call from Thomas Wilson's office came 3 days after her return to New York. The voice on the phone was courteous but direct. "Ms. Hernandez, Mr. Wilson would like to meet with you at headquarters in Atlanta this Friday regarding a special project. Can you be available?" Sofia's heart raced as she agreed to the meeting. Special project. The phrase was vague but laden with significance. Whatever was coming, it represented a dramatic departure from her expected career trajectory. When she arrived at Horizon Airways headquarters, a gleaming glass and steel structure that embodied the company's aspirational identity, Sofia felt profoundly out of place. As a flight attendant, she had never had reason to visit the corporate offices, and the soaring atrium with its suspended model aircraft and wall of historic photographs was intimidating in its grandeur. Thomas Wilson met her in the lobby himself, rather than sending an assistant, a subtle signal of the importance he attached to their meeting. "Ms. Hernandez," he greeted her, extending his hand. "Thank you for coming. Walter and Josephine Blackwood speak very highly of you." Sofia felt a flush of pride mixed with uncertainty. "Thank you, sir. I'm still not sure why I'm here." "Let's talk about that," Wilson said, leading her to a conference room rather than his office. Another subtle choice that put her more at ease than the intimidating environment of an executive suite might have. Once they were seated, Wilson came directly to the point. "The incident aboard Flight 101 has initiated a comprehensive review of our service culture, particularly in our premium cabins. The issues it revealed are not limited to one flight or one crew. They point to broader patterns that have developed over time, patterns that contradict our founding values." He slid a folder across the table to her. "This is an outline of what we're calling the Blackwood Initiative, a comprehensive effort to realign our service culture with our founding principles. As part of this initiative, we're establishing a team of cultural ambassadors who will help us understand the current reality and shape the path forward." Sofia opened the folder, scanning its contents with growing amazement. The initiative was far more comprehensive than she had expected. Not a superficial public relations exercise, but a fundamental reassessment of service standards, training protocols, and performance metrics. "Walter specifically recommended you for this team, Sofia. He believes your perspective as a relatively new employee, combined with your evident commitment to treating all passengers with respect, would be invaluable." Sofia looked up from the documents, overwhelmed by the scope of what was being proposed. "But I didn't even speak up when I should have. I waited until Captain Rivera intervened. Wilson nodded, acknowledging the point. Yes, Walter mentioned that as well. He also mentioned your honesty in recognizing that failure and your reflection on what it revealed about our culture. The fact that a competent, compassionate employee felt unable to challenge discriminatory behavior speaks volumes about the environment we've allowed to develop. He leaned forward, his expression earnest. We don't need perfect people for this initiative, Sophia. We need honest ones. People who understand their own limitations while striving to overcome them. The position he offered was a temporary reassignment, 6 months initially working directly with the training department and senior leadership to assess current practices and develop new approaches. It was an extraordinary opportunity, but it also represented a significant challenge. Sophia would be thrust into high-level discussions with executives and expected to provide candid feedback about entrenched practices. This won't be easy, Wilson cautioned. You'll face resistance from those who see nothing wrong with the current approach. You may encounter resentment from colleagues who don't understand why you've been selected for this role. Are you prepared for that challenge? Sophia thought about her parents who had left everything familiar behind to create better opportunities for their children. She thought about the passengers she had seen treated differently based on their appearance or accent. She thought about the Blackwoods standing with quiet dignity in the galley while being denied the seats they had rightfully purchased. Yes, she said finally. I'm willing, not because it will be easy, but because it matters. The challenges began almost immediately. When news of her appointment to the initiative team spread throughout the company, reactions were mixed. Some colleagues congratulated her sincerely. Others implied that she had somehow benefited from being in the right place at the right time, as if witnessing discrimination against the company's founders had been a stroke of good fortune rather than a moral crisis. More difficult were the sessions with veteran crew members who saw nothing wrong with the practices being examined. During one particularly tense focus group, a senior flight attendant with 25 years of experience grew visibly frustrated. This whole initiative is an overreaction to one unfortunate incident, she insisted. Premium service has always involved recognizing and catering to the specific needs of different types of passengers. That's not discrimination. It's personalization. Sophia had prepared for such objections, but still found them challenging to address without seeming judgmental or naive. There's a difference between personalizing service based on expressed preferences and making assumptions about who deserves attention based on appearance. She responded carefully. One honors the individual, the other imposes our judgments on them. The room fell silent as her words registered. It was a distinction that many had never considered, framing the issue not as a matter of policy, but of basic respect. These moments, when reframing led to recognition, gave Sophia confidence that the initiative could create meaningful change. But there were also setbacks, resistance from middle management concerned about metrics and efficiency, skepticism from crew members who feared being monitored for political correctness, pushback from some premium passengers who had benefited from the unwritten hierarchy of service. 3 months into her new role, Sophia faced her most significant challenge when she was asked to present preliminary findings to the executive leadership team, including CEO Jane Mitchell. Standing before this group of senior leaders, Sophia felt her confidence waver. The stakes suddenly seemed enormous. Her observations and recommendations could shape policy affecting thousands of employees and millions of passengers. As she arranged her notes at the podium, Sophia spotted Walter Blackwood at the conference table. He gave her a small, encouraging nod, a gesture of confidence that steadied her nerves. "Good afternoon," she began, her voice stronger than she had expected. "For the past 3 months, our team has been examining service patterns across Horizon Airways with particular focus on how appearance and perceived status influence service delivery. What we've found is a significant gap between our stated values and our operational reality." She proceeded to outline with remarkable clarity the patterns they had documented, the subtle cues that communicated who was deemed worthy of extra attention, the informal rewards for prioritizing certain passengers, the implicit penalties for treating all passengers with equal warmth and respect. The most troubling aspect, she continued, is that these practices aren't written in any manual or taught in any training session. They're transmitted through example, through praise and criticism, through stories shared in crew lounges. This makes them particularly difficult to address through traditional policy changes or training modules. As she moved to her recommendations, which included revised performance metrics, peer observation protocols, and restructured training programs, Sophia noted the executives' reactions. Some nodded in agreement, others looked uncomfortable or defensive. But all were paying close attention, a testament to the importance the company was now placing on this initiative. When she finished her presentation, CEO Jane Mitchell was the first to speak. "Thank you, Ms. Hernandez. Your candor and insight are precisely what we need. I particularly appreciate your point that we can't simply mandate change through policy. We need to address the informal systems that have allowed these practices to develop and persist." Walter Blackwood spoke next, his deep voice carrying an authority that came not just from his position but from the wisdom of his years. "Sophia has articulated something I've been trying to express since the incident aboard Flight 101, that the gap between our stated values and our operational reality isn't just a matter of individual behavior, but of cultural patterns that have been reinforced over time. Addressing those patterns will require sustained commitment at every level of the organization." The validation from both the current CEO and the founder gave Sophia's recommendations a weight and credibility they might otherwise have lacked. As the meeting continued, she found herself an active participant in the strategic discussion, rather than merely a presenter of information. A remarkable shift for someone who just months earlier had been a junior flight attendant, afraid to challenge discriminatory practices she witnessed. This transformation, from hesitant observer to confident advocate, reflected the broader change that the Blackwood Initiative sought to create throughout Horizon Airways. It wasn't just about new policies or training modules. It was about empowering every employee to uphold the dignity-centered principles upon which the airline had been founded. For Sophia, the journey was personal as well as professional. Each time she spoke up in a meeting, each time she challenged a long-standing practice, each time she advocated for treating all passengers with equal respect, regardless of appearance, she was overcoming the fear that had kept her silent aboard Flight 101. She was becoming not just a better employee, but a more courageous person. Someone willing to stand for principles, even when doing so was uncomfortable or carried professional risk. As the Blackwood Initiative moved from assessment to implementation, Sophia's role evolved accordingly. She became a key trainer in the new approach, helping crew members understand not just the what, but the why of the changes being introduced. Her combination of frontline experience and moral clarity made her particularly effective in translating abstract principles into practical behaviors. 6 months into the initiative, Walter invited Sophia to join him for lunch in the executive dining room, a space she would never have imagined accessing before Flight 101. As they discussed the progress of the initiative, he asked a question that caught her off guard. "Sophia," he said, setting down his water glass, "how would you assess your own journey these past months?" She considered the question carefully. "It's been challenging," she admitted. "There have been times when I've doubted whether I was the right person for this role, whether I had the experience or authority to influence such significant changes." Walter nodded, encouraging her to continue. "But I've also found that speaking truth, even uncomfortable truth, gets easier with practice. And I've discovered that my perspective as someone who recently experienced the contradiction between our stated values and our actual practices has been valuable in helping others recognize that gap." Walter smiled, pleased with her assessment. "That growth, from fear to courage, from silence to advocacy, is exactly what we're trying to cultivate throughout the company. You've not only contributed to the initiative, you've embodied its core purpose. As Sophia returned to her office after lunch, she reflected on how dramatically her professional life had changed in the 6 months since Flight 101. What had begun as a routine transatlantic crossing had become a turning point, not just in her career, but in her understanding of her own agency and responsibility. She had learned that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the willingness to act despite it. A lesson that would continue to shape her journey long after the formal initiative was complete. The transformation that began with a single incident aboard Horizon Airways Flight 101 extended far beyond one airline. As news of the Blackwood initiative spread throughout the aviation industry, other carriers began to take notice, not merely out of curiosity, but out of recognition that the principles being implemented at Horizon addressed issues present in their own service cultures as well. The change was accelerated by passengers who experienced the difference and began to expect similar treatment across airlines. Frequent travelers who flew multiple carriers noted the contrast between Horizon's consistent, dignity-centered approach and the more stratified appearance-based service still common elsewhere. Their feedback, shared through social media and review platforms, created marketplace pressure that caught the attention of executives throughout the industry. Within 3 years, most major international carriers had implemented some version of the principles Horizon had pioneered. The impact extended beyond aviation to other premium service industries. Luxury hotels, high-end restaurants, and exclusive retail establishments began to recognize similar patterns in their own customer interactions. The Blackwood principles offered a framework for examining and addressing these practices. From a business perspective, the initiative's impact on Horizon's competitive position was unmistakable. The airline's market share in premium international routes increased by 8% within 3 years, with particular growth among technology executives, entrepreneurs, and other professionals who often dressed casually despite their means to purchase premium travel. On his 80th birthday, Walter Blackwood reflected on the journey that had taken him from a young black pilot facing discrimination to the founder of a global airline now recognized for its commitment to treating all passengers with dignity. When Josephine and I founded this airline, he told a gathering of employees, "We made a simple promise that we would create a company where everyone would be treated with dignity regardless of appearance or background." That promise came from our own experiences of being judged and excluded based on how we looked, rather than who we were. He paused, his gaze sweeping across the assembled employees. The legacy of Flight 101 isn't found in new policies or procedures. It's found in the renewed commitment to seeing the humanity in every person we serve, regardless of what they're wearing or how they speak. True wealth isn't found in exclusivity or segregation. It's found in the freedom to be exactly who you are and to be respected for that authentic self. For Sofia Hernandez, now an established leader within Horizon, the journey from witnessing discrimination to helping reshape the airline's culture had transformed not only her career, but her understanding of her own agency and responsibility. She had learned that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the willingness to act despite it, a lesson that would continue to shape her journey for years to come. The true measure of first class isn't where you sit, but how you treat others along the journey. If you enjoyed this story about dignity, respect, and challenging unfair assumptions, please like, subscribe, and share this video with others who might appreciate its message. Your support helps us create more content that inspires positive change in our world. Remember, as Walter Blackwood reminds us, the true measure of character isn't in how we treat those we perceive as important, but in how we treat everyone we encounter on life's journey.